Oh, and then I'll tell you a little story. I was on my way to India, and I stopped in Italy to visit my relatives. And I got to southern Italy, Frosinone district, where my family is from, and I stayed at my aunt's house. And every morning, she would get up, and her mother was very sick, was bedridden, and died about 2 months after I left. Every morning, my cousin would get up, and she would go to the altar in her mother's room, and she had 3 pictures. She had Jesus, Mary, and St. Francis, the family's patron saint. And she would light a candle, put a flower, and say a prayer. And she would take a piece, if she just made a loaf of bread, or she just picked some tomatoes, and she'd put something on the altar. And she'd say a prayer. And then we'd go out in the day and work in the vineyards, because they had 9 acres of vineyard. When we came back in the afternoon, or early evening, she would wash up, and she'd go back to the altar. She would light the candle again, because she had blown it out after in the morning. And she would say her prayers, and when she was done with her prayers, she would blow out the candle, take the flower, and break off the petals and put them around her mother's bed as a blessing for her mother, because her mother couldn't get up to do the prayer. So this was her way of sharing that, the blessedness, the sanctity. This flower had been on the altar and had gotten sanctified. And then she took the food, whether it was a tomato or a loaf of bread or an orange, and she would split it and give a piece to each person in the house, to her mother, to myself, to her husband, and her 2 little children. She did this every day when I was there. And then I left. I went traveling, continued my adventure through Greece, Turkey, Iran, ended up in India, ended up in the Himalayas. Met this teacher, took initiation relatively quickly, I guess. Began that process. The following year I was up in the mountains, and I was in a retreat. And and I found a nice kind of cottage out in the forest where I did this retreat. And in the preparation for the retreat, the woman, this old widow from the village nearby that owned the place, I was helping her prepare the house, the cottage, for me to do the retreat, and she was doing that. So I would have occasion to go to her house in the village, and sometimes I would spend the night there. And in the morning, she would get up, and she would go to her altar room, and because I was a monk, I was allowed in her altar room. And she had 3 pictures. She had Shiva, she had Ram, and she had Hanuman. And she'd get up in the morning, and she'd wash up, and she'd light not a candle, but an oil lamp. And she'd put a flower, and she'd put a piece of fruit or a sweet, and she'd say her prayers. And then, unlike my aunt in Italy, she wouldn't blow out the candle. She'd leave it lit. And then she'd go out into her rice fields. She'd work in the rice fields or work in her apple orchard during the day. And in the evening, when she came back, and I had occasion to see this in the evening if I was there, as she would go back, she would wash up again, and she'd continue to do her prayers. And then she would wave out the light, because in Hinduism you don't blow out a candle, you wave it out. And then she would take the flower, and she would take the petals, and she would put them around the house to bless the house. And then she would take the fruit or the sweet that was on the altar, and she would pass out a piece to everyone. And the first time I saw this, I reflected on my aunt in Italy. And I said, the only thing that's different are the pictures. And it was really my initiation to comparative religion. The seeing that religion is a culturally evolved approach to the unknown, and but that as human beings, while our cultures may be different, we share a commonality of being humans. And I think that there are certain inherent human approaches towards dealing with the unknown. There are the intellectual, theological approaches, and there's the simplistic village approach. And I think that in many ways we have more in common than we like to admit, or that scholars like to admit sometimes. That doesn't collapse the differences. The differences are important, but yet the commonalities are also vital and important, and tells us something about what it is to be human.